Hi, I'm Ryan.
Hi, I'm Jess, and you're listening to Your Therapist is Not Okay.
On this episode, we will answer another question from a listener who asks us, does my therapist have a list of potential diagnoses for me? Do they share this with other providers I work with now, or if I might transfer to another therapist? And if I asked my therapist, would they tell me about the diagnoses or the contents of the notes?
Hmm. So today's episode will be all about what does your therapist write about you? Diagnoses, notes, and disclosure. This question can be kind of interesting for me because in Canada, the reason I chose to be a psychotherapist is because we actually don't diagnose.
Hmm.
I found when I was choosing between being a psychologist who does diagnose and a psychotherapist who doesn't, I really leaned towards being a psychotherapist.
Hmm.
I think for me, there was something about not having that clinical power or need to diagnose in front of me, needing to do prescriptions, that I could just be with somebody, especially because I wanted to specialize in trauma and work with people right in their story, that I didn't necessarily feel the need to have
Hmm.
to be someone that diagnoses them with some sort of ailment. And I found for myself, at least looking at different psychotherapists when I was younger, I saw a lot of them were in the hospital systems, or a lot of them were in this kind of more severe cases with their clients. I've now learned that's not always true,
Yeah.
but when I was choosing it, I felt like I just want to sit with somebody in the room, create a safe space, and be able to really dive into what they're bringing rather than have diagnoses hanging over me.
Hmm.
But I know that's actually not the case getting to know you. In the States, it doesn't matter if you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist, diagnosis is part of what you have to do with any client you see. Is that right? And if so, what's been your experience of that, Ryan?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, yeah, there are, as you said, like differences between different countries and different licensing organizations about those expectations around diagnosis. So before I started my postgrad studies, I was already working with diagnoses as an addictions counselor in my
Mm,
home state of Colorado. Um, where I wasn't a licensed addictions counselor, but I was what is now called a certified addiction specialist.
mm,
And part of our role was to like suggest diagnoses that could then be endorsed by a licensed addictions counselor.
mm,
Um, and part of the reason why that system exists in the States is the regulatory bodies.
mhm.
They state that you have to have a diagnosis, and also because of the way we have private insurance in the States. For all the many ups and downs of that system, a complicated system, and we're not going to delve into that too much today. But for someone to be able to access care that is
Yeah.
provided, paid for in part or in whole by their health insurance, they have to have a diagnosis.
Mm.
And in fact, you're really only allowed to see a client, depending on the system, once or perhaps twice without a diagnosis. So you could not have a diagnosis on like session one,
Mm.
um, but then you can't bill for that type of session with the same person again. So those future, so not only do you have to have a diagnosis, you really have to have a diagnosis very quickly.
In order to then be able to actually pay for the sessions with insurance.
Exactly.
Wow.
And to further kind of complicate that, our public insurance for folks who have any form of kind of a disability that is endorsed by the state or have are low income is called Medicaid. And if you have Medicaid, you actually get really good access to psychotherapy. You have
Mm.
as many sessions as you want,
Oh, wow.
as well, up to once per day,
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
which is a lot,
Yep, yep.
of the same billing code type.
Hmm. But you'll need to have a diagnosis really soon in order to have Medicaid, is what you're saying?
In order to bill that successfully, you'll need to. And where I was going with that is it's not only to bill Medicaid, because in fact, it is illegal to to bill someone out of pocket,
Oh,
even if it's their wish. if they have Medicaid.
Oh, really?
You
So,
can't charge them. It's a way of protecting, theoretically, it's a way of protecting low income folks from opportunist health systems
okay.
that would just take advantage of them and bill them
Mm.
more than Medicaid would recoup them. And actually, the remittance from Medicaid, depending on county and et cetera, is actually pretty good. I'm gonna bracket that there and not talk any more really about insurance. The important thing to know is in the States, psychotherapists must diagnose their clients.
And you're saying pretty soon, like you see the client once and you need to kind of have your finger on the pulse of what kind of diagnosis you're going to give them.
Absolutely. So when I train people for psychotherapy practice, I'm one of the things I'm training them for a first session is you got to get to know your client.
Hmm.
You've got to let your client get to know you and see how the fit is, see if they're comfortable, and you have to immediately be flagging your first things for diagnosis about. So you could then go away and talk to your supervisor or consult with someone after the first session, which you can do diagnosis deferred for,
Hmm.
and then bring questions back for your client to maybe kind of clarify or specify in session two. But by the end of session two, in the note for session two that says what happened in session two, you will have to assign a diagnosis.
And would these diagnoses be as simple as maybe anxiety, depression, or would they also be quite extreme, like personality disorders?
They could be any of those,
Wow.
absolutely. They
Okay.
could be any of those. Most of the time, when someone is coming with a we could call it maybe a more complex diagnosis, like something that presents across the lifespan, like a personality disorder or maybe a psychotic disorder. These are the different kind of like classes within the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual.
Hmm.
Um, you would also have a co-occurring disorder. So you would probably also meet the criteria for, say, generalized anxiety disorder
Mm.
or major depressive disorder or an adjustment disorder.
Wow.
All these different things. And so a lot of people, practitioners, may decide to first diagnose with something less intimidating,
Yeah.
whether it's because they're uncertain or because they're, cautious about the impact on the client. But I try to emphasize and teach what I call ethical diagnosis,
Okay.
which is that I'm going to be speaking with my clients about their diagnosis, about
Hmm.
what I'm thinking about their diagnosis. I'm going to be asking them, when I say this diagnosis, what comes up for you?
Hmm.
And I'm going to use my judgment to think too if, like, actually, it seems like this wouldn't be the time to bring up that diagnosis.
Mm.
We're going to talk more about this. And I might still in there say, and I am still curious and kind of wondering about how trauma has impacted you. So
Hmm.
maybe we'll come back to this conversation in the near future. But based on the observations that I've shared with you, the symptoms that you've told me about, this is sounding like it might be X, Y, or Z.
Mm.
What do you think about that? Is that helpful to you? Is that scary to you? Have you heard this before? And
Mm.
having that kind of whole discussion. Some clients will come with a whole list of diagnoses they've gotten from other therapists or from their medical providers, and some will come with kind of no idea
Hmm.
about what that might be. We trained at the same university, of course. So at the University of Edinburgh, we're not really focused on diagnosis a lot. We're taught kind of how to think about diagnosis in a different way,
Hmm.
etc. So what I really think about any diagnosis needs to be in the service of the client's healing. So to me, there's no point in giving a client a diagnosis that won't help me help them.
Mm.
To me, it's never going to be about just assigning or labeling.
Hmm.
It's going to be about this will help us make a treatment plan together
Mm.
or learn something about ourselves together. But I guess with that, I want to say that there's a distinction between that kind of ethical diagnosis discussion and understanding together, and then what might sometimes happen in the medical field or once that's in like the electronic health records that we have.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, once you put it in there, you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, and that actually brings up an interesting point for me. Sometimes clients come to see me and they'd like a diagnosis,
Mhm.
but I specialize in highly stigmatized personality disorder. I specialize in borderline personality disorder, which a lot of the time I'm working with the trauma that clients might have been by going through the system. And if somebody comes to me wanting to be diagnosed with that, it actually presents a bit of a predicament. For
Mm,
one, I can't diagnose, and that's
yeah.
fine. But that's not my out. Sometimes it's actually walking them through to say, like, why don't we talk about why you think you have this?
Mm,
And I might be pretty honest with them to say, sometimes BPD might be the very first thing somebody sees with you if you go to get help externally, that might then create an understanding of who you are before you even open your mouth.
there's a lot of judgments and stigma attached to that.
Yeah. I mean, narcissistic personality disorder could also have that. How many people want to diagnose their partner right now with narcissism?
Usually we see the partners of narcissistic people,
Yes.
not the narcissistic people.
But I think with borderline, they are really curious. Borderline clients are incredibly insightful,
Mm,
very smart. They usually know more about BPD than even I would, and I'm
mm,
a specialist in this. It's can be really affirming for us to work within that parameter, even if there's no diagnoses.
mm,
But it can be me cautioning them against getting a formal diagnosis so that that's not the first thing that comes in front of them. Caveat, not everyone's going to treat somebody with BPD poorly,
yeah.
but I don't know that. And
Hmm.
so I've heard enough stories, and I've actually talked to enough people and hospital staff to kind of have that affirmed in my professional opinion and life, to kind of realize that, like, sometimes that might not be helpful for you, even though you might really want it.
Mm,
At other times, it can be incredibly helpful. Sometimes a client just having a name for something that they're dealing with can feel incredibly affirming. And sending them to a professional that might be able to do that, it might even be because of medication.
mm.
You can't get ADHD meds without having a
No, you
diagnosis.
cannot.
And if you really want that help, that diagnosis is going to set you on a path that might be able to give you the kind of care that you need.
Hmm.
And at that point, I'm totally happy to send them off to be able to get that kind of care and diagnoses. Um, but it does kind of present an interesting predicament. What does a diagnosis say about you?
Hmm.
And if that's on your chart immediately when you go in to see somebody, what might it say about you that you haven't said about yourself? I
Mm.
guess would be what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely agree that, that's a present concern. It comes into that kind of ethics of diagnosis, very much so. And I think in addition to thinking about, will this help me help the client or not,
Mm,
is that question that I kind of hear within that of, will this increase or decrease my client's access to care?
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Like you're saying, can't get the meds without the diagnosis in some cases,
Hmm.
or, working in substance use environments, you often can't access the long-term care or maybe the sobriety housing
Mm.
without some sort of diagnosis or letter from a provider.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. That's interesting hearing about the States and kind of the differences between Canada and the States, and how for us it does have a delineation. Often when people ask me what the difference is, diagnosis actually is the very
Mm,
first thing I usually say is, what's going to differentiate me from a psychologist and a psychiatrist
mm,
who would have a medical degree on top of that.
okay.
Yeah.
I think for that, not to segue too long in that, but in the States, the way I usually delineate it is based on how the training would differ,
Mm.
right? So I think about, for psychotherapists, counselors, we're really trained a lot on how to listen,
Hmm.
how to attend, how to be with,
Hmm.
how to think about how someone's like social and psychic structure is developed and maintained. Psychology, there's going to be a lot more body science added into that, neurology, um, those kinds of different life sciences that we
Mm.
might know some parts of because we've learned them, and most of us have taken psychology courses early in our career as well.
Sure.
But a psychologist will often have a little more of that specialization. And then a psychiatrist has a medical training.
Hmm.
So they think through that lens of um, what's wrong with you and how do I fix it in the least amount of time,
Yeah,
efficiently. And I don't mean that to sound like in a bad way, but the medical system is focused largely on efficiency.
absolutely.
But to kind of answer the other part of this person's question, I wanted to ask you, Jess, have you ever had clients ask to see their notes? And what do you do when that happens?
Yes. Yeah, I have. In two different cases, actually. One is if I'm working with a client that's been involved in a court case. This is one of those places in Canada where our notes can be subpoenaed.
Mm.
I don't know if clients always know that. We are so bound by confidentiality, but this is one of those ones where we will have to hand over our notes if there's a subpoena and the courts need it. That can be quite complicated depending on what a client's talking about. There
Mm-hmm.
have been cases where I've gone to my licensing board um, to ask if I can get out of it. And what I did in those cases is I almost always, like, because I'm virtual, I'll share my screen. They'll see everything that the courts are going to get.
The
Just,
client.
yeah, the client,
Mm.
just so that they're on board with me.
Yeah.
Like, that there's nothing happening here that's not immediately, or that they're going to have something that blindsides them. I want them to kind of know what's being subpoenaed. Um, and I've done that. Takes a session because I like to walk through it. Yeah, but actually, it can feel quite affirming for a client to feel like, okay, Jess is, even though something's happening that's out of Jess's hands, she's not something like she's not going to be someone that still doesn't have my back.
Mm.
And the second option, someone might be curious.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as I said, I specialize in borderline personality disorder. They have been used to sometimes having people in their lives that they don't trust. And that can come to the foreground with their therapist.
Yeah.
And so there have been times where a client will be like, Jess, I want to know what you're writing about me. And they are allowed. I don't think a lot of clients realize this. The
Mm.
notes that your therapist writes about you, you have absolute every right to ask for them.
I think technically they own them.
Yeah. I
We're the custodian.
We're the custodians of their notes. Yeah, and in even that language, their notes. Um, I don't email them
Mm.
because it's part of the work. And so I asked the client, is it okay if I print them all out? You can have them at the end if you want them, but I want to walk you through why I wrote certain things, or I want you to be able to ask me questions. Can we use this as part of our work?
Mm.
And that has been incredible. Like, they'll be like, oh, you haven't asked me that question. You're like, I know, but I've been thinking about it. And they're like, I totally get why. And it can be this kind of thing where the notes become part of our work, or they
Mm.
can see, they're like, oh, yeah, I did say that.
Mm.
And it's been not uncommon where a client is like, yeah, I know all this. I'm like, what were you expecting me to have in your
Yes, you
notes?
were there.
You were there. I have this ethic.
Mm.
That I always write my notes, knowing that a client might ask. Now, it doesn't change what I write, but if I have a question or I want to say something, I might even say, I'm going to put that in the notes.
Mm.
That feels like I have this language that I use with my clients. Anyone listening that is a client would know this. I call it the shelf. There might be something that you're talking to me about that you don't want to dive into now.
Mm.
And it might be like, Jess, I really want to tell you about my relationship with my sister. Not today. And I'm like, is that a shelf? And we put it on the shelf.
Mm.
I keep a log of that, so that'll go into their notes.
Mm.
I also do trophies. If we've had like a big breakthrough, or if something's happened where like we come up with a discovery, I'll have trophies next to the shelf.
Mm.
It's a very funny part of my notes. And it's kind of neat to keep track of those things. We often think about everything we have to work on, but the trophies are kind of wonderful in therapy. And so I do have an ethic that a client won't see something. They might see a question I haven't asked, but it's not because it's like out with what we've been talking about.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's really helpful. Again, in my experience, I've had some clients ask for their notes and see things of a diagnosis kind of standard
Mm.
that really have hurt them. Like some clients can feel betrayed by seeing something in there that
Sure.
they didn't have any indication that their psychotherapist might have been thinking.
Right.
And so for me, I think based on those experiences, I don't want to be anything but safe for a client. And
Mm.
my notes are really to keep track and to kind of note the session.
Yeah.
Maybe to kind of draw back in with the shelf or kind of keep track of that. But it's not about, for me at least in my case notes, it's not about putting things in there that a client wouldn't already be working with me on.
Right. So in the States, there are certain things that we're required to have in the notes, again, for insurance,
Yeah, yeah.
such as the interventions that we've used, um, what's our assessment of what the client is presenting.
Sure.
So if a client asks to see my notes, the first thing that they would probably notice is that it's in a very clinical language. It's not necessarily in the exact language that we talk about it.
Mm.
But I do similar, yeah, just like you, I think about my clients when I'm writing the notes. And I
Yeah.
think, how will it be for them to read this?
Yeah.
Most of my clients, I would say, don't ask to see, but they all could. I'm
Yeah.
very aware. They all could. And I also think, how would they feel having this read out loud in front of a court?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's the potentiality that we're kind of planning for with notes.
Mm.
This could go in front of the client. This could go in front of the GP. This could go in front of the judge,
Mm-hmm.
the jury. Um, so yes, and that's largely what I train as well, is to have your notes be clear
Mm-hmm.
and not too long and not more information than is necessary.
Absolutely. We are also trained in that having your notes be pretty factual is really
Hmm.
important. Do you find if someone ever asked you that you'd also want to go through it with them just so that they could see there might be a difference in language, but you can kind of explain that and kind of walk them through the why? Or have you never had to do that with your clients?
I interestingly have never had a client ask me for their notes.
Oh, okay.
I have had clients ask me, "What do you write?" And I kind of have the same conversation we're having now.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think the time that it's probably most present is session one,
Mm.
because session one I do tend to have a notepad and a pen,
Mm.
and that's usually the only time I will have that.
Mm.
Um, and so I acknowledge it, and I say, I want you to know that I'm going to take a few notes today, and I don't normally take notes during session. And if at any point you're thinking, what are they writing about me? I'm happy to hand you the clipboard.
Mm.
There's nothing on here that you didn't just say,
Yeah.
that's in very scrawled, difficult to read shorthand. So I will also dictate it to you
Yeah, you might
if
need a little bit
you need
deciphering.
an interpreter.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, yeah. And so that also makes me think about, the last kind of part of our listener's question, which was, how does this work between therapists? If I'm moving to a different practitioner, or if I need, for some reason, my therapist,
Mhm.
to talk to my medical doctor or share some notes with my medical doctor. Um, if I'm getting a client from another therapist, I usually don't want to see the notes. If the client communicates with me that they really want me to have the notes and they really want me to read them, then I will.
Mhm.
But my preference is, and I will say this to clients too, I want to hear about you from you.
Mhm. I am the exact same way.
Mm.
I've had clients be like, "What have you heard about me?" And I said, "What I'm about to hear today." No, I'll usually say the exact same language that actually, if you want me to, I can. But in my mind, it's going to be a bit of a rewind for you. You've already probably said your story.
Mhm.
But for me, I'm going to be hearing it for the first time. And I want that. I want to be listening to it without any kind of um, other person's opinion or any biases or any of that. I want to be
Mhm.
able to be there quite, quite fresh.
Yeah.
I also want clients to know that it won't actually happen without your consent. One thing that we do have, and sometimes we will talk to you about, but you will hear it, that sometimes our confidentiality might be within a circle of
Mm.
care. That especially will happen if you're working with a student or anybody that's qualifying that has a supervisor.
Mhm.
They'll probably anonymize who you are, but might give some of the details.
Mhm.
If they're doing that, you will know that. They'll
Mhm.
tell you that, that circle of care might extend beyond just you and them. Um, but if you want me to talk to your GP, I will get you to sign a release of information or a consent to talk.
Yes.
And the cool thing with those is actually you can choose what you don't want me to say.
Mhm.
You might say, Jess, I want you to listen, but I don't want you to talk. Perfect. You
Mhm.
can tell me that. Or you can say, you can talk about these things, but could you avoid telling them this? Absolutely. Like,
Mm.
absolutely. Clients actually have a lot of power over that. And if I'm a couples therapist and one of the people say, do you want to talk to my personal therapist? Again, even though you verbally consented, I most likely will still give a written consent to see if there's anything that you haven't told me that you don't want said. Um, so all of those things actually give you as a client a lot of power. The problem is, as I see it, is that you may not know you have that power. Like you might not actually realize that
Hmm.
those are some of the protocols that we will follow.
Yeah, yeah, and in the States, and just and an ethical practice in general, anywhere. Like I would never, without that written permission, talk to others in the world about you and your therapy.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's very important. And yes, I do very much agree with you that these are things that clients might not necessarily know.
Mhm.
It's not everyday knowledge,
No.
the extreme details of
Mhm.
therapeutic confidentiality.
No.
Um, but that's so important. It's so important that you know you can trust and be safe with your therapist.
Yeah.
And that's why we have and respect all these safeguards
Mhm.
around that.
If as a client, if you want to see your therapist notes, they're not going to be upset with you.
No.
They will happily show you. And you can always say, I'd love to do it during session.
Mm,
Maybe next session, can you pull up a couple notes? I just want to know where we're at together. You're allowed to ask for that. And to know that by doing so, you probably won't, it'll probably be kind of boring. You'll probably see that,
yes.
but having your therapist walk you through, that's a really nice gift for your therapist as well, so that they also have a chance to use it as part of your work together. That alliance in therapy is so powerful, and
Mhm.
being able to ask them questions in the here and now is really awesome.
Yeah.
But to our listener that asked this question, thank you. This is fabulous. This is one of those questions that Ryan and I probably would take for granted
Hmm.
that clients actually definitely would be thinking about. So you've opened our eyes to actually a question I don't even think we would have talked about. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Very insightful. Very appreciated. And thank you to all of you for tuning in to Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
If you have any questions that you want to ask us, just know we would be happy to answer. This is one of our favorite parts of this podcast.
Absolutely. And the best way to ask that question is on our Instagram, which is at Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too, at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.